Smoke reached the supper table before anyone understood that Beckett House was on fire. On the evening of the 14th of May 1818, the windows of the Mayfair townhouse stood open to a mild London night. Candles gleamed against polished silver, and Sir James Beckett had been explaining to the Duke of Ormskirk why Diana ought to be included in Lady Marchwood's next musical evening. When Grace smelled scorched silk, she set down her wineglass. No one else moved. Then a maid appeared at the drawing-room doors with terror in her face. "There's smoke upstairs, sir." Grace was already rising before her uncle answered. She had spent 11 years in Sir James's household, learning that when something went wrong, people looked for her, even if they rarely looked at her otherwise. "Where?" she asked. "Miss Diana's dressing room." Grace gathered her skirts and crossed the hall at once. Behind her came the scrape of chairs and several male voices offering contradictory instructions. "By the time, sir, James ordered someone to fetch water." Grace had already called 2 footmen from the passage, sent a maid for blankets, and told another servant to make certain no one remained in the upper rooms. Smoke curled along the ceiling of the landing. Diana stood near the stairs in a pale evening gown, one hand pressed to her throat. "My curtains," she said. "I don't know how it happened." Grace passed her without answering. The dressing-room door stood open. A servant had dragged down one burning curtain, and the flames had begun to die beneath soaked wool, though the room remained dense with smoke and the bitter smell of charred fabric. Grace covered her mouth with her sleeve. "No more water near the dressing table," she said. "The floorboards are already slick. Take the basin to the window side." A young maid stumbled from the adjoining closet, coughing hard enough to bend double. Grace caught her by the shoulders and guided her into the corridor. "Easy, you're going downstairs, but Miss Diana's things can be replaced. You can't." The girl stared at her for one startled second, then obeyed. Grace stayed long enough to make certain there was no second flame hidden behind the hangings. When she finally stepped back into the ruined dressing room, soot marked one sleeve of her grey evening gown, and her throat stung from smoke. Richard Atherstone, Duke of Ormskirk, stood just inside the doorway. He had removed his evening coat and given it to a servant carrying a wet blanket. Even in disorder, he looked controlled, dark-haired and severe, the kind of man whose silence usually rearranged a room more effectively than another man's shouting. His gaze moved over Grace once, precise and searching. "Are you hurt?" he asked. No, their eyes held for a fraction too long. Grace had noticed him before this evening, as most women in London noticed a duke, but her interest had never been simple admiration. Richard listened when other men displayed themselves. He remembered details. Twice during the past month, she had caught him watching her while she repaired some small household difficulty no one else wished to acknowledge. She had never known what to make of it. Tonight, with smoke between them and Diana weeping somewhere down the corridor, there was no room to wonder. Grace looked toward the scorched dressing table and saw something beneath it. A small brass night taper stand lay on its side near the blackened fringe of the carpet. She bent and stopped just short of touching it. Soot darkened the metal, but the intertwined initials remained visible. D.B. Diana Beckett, Grace. Diana's voice came sharply from the doorway. Grace straightened. Diana's face had gone pale. "What are you looking at?" "Your taper stand. That proves nothing." Grace had not said that it did. Sir James arrived behind his daughter, breathing heavily from the stairs. "What taper stand?" Richard stepped aside as Sir James entered. Grace pointed. That one. Sir James looked at the blackened brass, then at Grace. Something in his expression changed so quickly that she almost doubted she had seen it. You were in this room before supper. Grace felt the direction of the evening altar. I came for Diana's gloves at her request. And the taper? I did not light it. Diana folded her arms tightly. I didn't leave one burning. The coughing maid had come no farther than the landing, but other servants were gathering beyond the doorway. Guests had begun climbing the stairs as well, drawn by the danger now that it had safely passed. Sir James lowered his voice, though not enough to make the accusation private. You expect me to believe that a fire began in a room you entered shortly before supper, entirely by chance? I expect you to believe the truth. The truth is that Diana might have died. Grace looked at her cousin. Diana had not been in the room when the fire began. Sir James knew that as well as she did. She was downstairs. That doesn't make your carelessness less serious. It was not my carelessness. Richard had said nothing. Grace became aware of him with painful clarity. He stood close enough to hear every word, yet his face had become unreadable. Sir James noticed, too. Perhaps that was why his anger sharpened into performance. He turned toward the Duke. Your Grace has shown unusual concern for my niece these past weeks. Perhaps you intend to make this a matter of honor. A few people had reached the landing. Silence spread faster than the smoke had. Richard's expression changed. Not much, only a tightening around the mouth, a stillness that looked less like uncertainty than an old door slamming shut. Sir James gave a humorless laugh. Well, if you believe her word over mine, do you mean to quarrel with a baronet over it? Grace looked at Richard. She did not want a quarrel. She did not want any man shedding blood over an accusation. She could answer herself. But she wanted, suddenly and foolishly, one thing from him. Not rescue, not rank, only that he refused to let her uncle turn her into something contemptible, because contempt was convenient. Richard looked at Sir James, then at the listening faces beyond the doorway. When he spoke, his voice was cold enough to extinguish whatever warmth had survived the fire. She isn't worth fighting for. No one moved. Grace heard a drop of water fall from the soaked curtain to the floor. Once. Then again. Richard's eyes met hers, and for the first time all evening she saw something break through his composure. Regret came too late to stop the words from becoming real. Grace felt no urge to cry. That surprised her. Instead, a deep stillness settled inside her, cleaner than anger. She turned to Sir James. You are quite right about one thing. Her uncle frowned. What is that supposed to mean? There should be no further quarrel over me. Diana opened her mouth, but Grace continued. I will leave Beckett House tonight. Sir James stared at her. Don't be absurd. I'm not. Where would you go? That is no longer your difficulty. His face reddened. You cannot simply walk out after this. Grace looked once at the scorched room, at the servants she had directed to safety, at the cousin whose belongings she had tried to save, and finally at the Duke who had chosen the easiest sentence in the room. I can. She went downstairs to arrange her departure before anyone could convert her dignity into another discussion. Less than an hour later, Richard stood beside his carriage in the damp Mayfair Street. Unable to forget the way Grace had looked at him after he spoke, his footman had opened the carriage door when a Beckett servant hurried down the steps behind him. The young man glanced toward the house before lowering his voice. Your Grace. Richard turned. What is it? The servant swallowed. About the taper. Richard went still. What about it? Miss Beckett didn't carry it upstairs. He looked back toward the bright windows of the house. Miss Diana did. I saw her take that brass stand-up herself before Miss Grace ever went to the dressing room. By 8 o'clock the next morning, Grace had already learned how much lighter a room could feel when no one in it expected her to apologize for existing. Mrs. Harcourt's modest Bloomsbury house was not grand. Its carpets had been turned to hide wear, the breakfast silver was mismatched, and the drawing-room looked onto a narrow garden where rain had darkened the bricks. Grace preferred it to every polished room at Beckett House. She had slept little. Smoke still roughened her throat, and when she had washed the soot from her hands in the small guest room before dawn, she had discovered a faint grey stain beneath one thumbnail that refused to disappear. It seemed fitting. Some things left marks after the danger itself had gone. Mrs. Harcourt, a widow of 62 who had known Grace's mother, had asked no questions until Grace was ready to answer them. She had merely ordered hot tea, found a clean nightgown, and said, "You'll stay as long as you need. I don't care what Mayfair has decided before breakfast." Grace had almost laughed. Instead, she had slept for perhaps 2 hours. Now she stood near the front window, fastening the cuff of a plain morning dress, while her plum silk parasol rested beside the hall stand below. She had bought it 12 years earlier with the first quarterly payment of the modest annuity settled on her by her mother's family. It had been the first beautiful thing Grace had ever chosen without asking whether someone else approved of the expense. She was thinking that she ought to find permanent rooms. Before Sir James discovered some method of turning Mrs. Harcourt's kindness into another accusation, when the maid appeared at the drawing-room door. "Miss Beckett, His Grace the Duke of Ormskirk has called." Grace's fingers stopped at her cuff. Mrs. Harcourt, seated beside the tea-tray, raised one silver eyebrow. "At this hour? He's not alone, ma'am. Lady Atherstone is with him." Grace knew the name. Richard's widowed aunt was respectable, formidable, and nearly 20 years older than he was. The choice was deliberate. He had not come to force propriety to bend around his rank. "Where is he?" Grace asked. "Still outside, miss." That surprised her more than the visit itself. "Outside?" His Grace said he would wait until you agreed to receive him. Mrs. Harcourt looked at Grace, not at the maid. Well, Grace's first instinct was no. It came cleanly, without fear. Then she remembered Richard's face after the words he had spoken. Not remorse alone, something closer to horror at himself. She did not owe him comfort for that horror, but she wanted to know why he had come. "You may show Lady Atherstone into the parlour," Grace said. She paused, "and His Grace as well." The maid disappeared. A minute later, Grace heard the front door open. Richard entered the downstairs parlour behind his aunt and stopped just inside it. He looked as if he had not slept. His dark coat was immaculate, but the discipline of his clothes only made the exhaustion in his face more apparent. Grace remained standing. Mrs. Harcourt took the chair nearest the open door. Lady Atherstone sat beside her after exchanging the briefest civil greetings, leaving Grace and Richard a measured distance apart beneath the pale morning light. Richard removed his gloves. He did not move closer. "Miss Beckett," he said, "I owe you an apology." Grace had expected explanation first. Men with rank usually began with reasons, as though reasons could reach backward and rearrange what another person had endured. Richard did not. "What I said last night was cruel," he continued. "It was also cowardly. I said it because I wanted to end Sir James's attempt to turn the matter into a quarrel of honour. I chose the quickest weapon available, and I used you as the cost of peace. I was wrong. Grace studied him. You were. He accepted the answer without flinching. I don't expect forgiveness because I've admitted it. Good. His aunt glanced down, perhaps hiding the faintest approval. Grace's throat hurt when she swallowed. Why are you here? Richard reached into his coat but stopped before touching the inner pocket. May I tell you what I learned after you left? You may tell me. One of Sir James's footmen followed me to the street. He said he saw Diana carry the brass taper stand upstairs before you entered the dressing room. Grace felt something inside her tighten, not with relief, but attention. Which footman? A young man called Thomas Reed. Did he see her light it? No. Did he see where she put it? No. Richard's gaze sharpened slightly. You're right. His statement doesn't prove you innocent. Grace looked toward the window. A cart rolled somewhere beyond the wet street, its wheels grinding over stone. It proves only that Diana handled the taper before the fire. Yes, and if you had known that before you spoke last night. Richard's answer came without hesitation. I should still have had no right to speak of your worth as I did. Grace turned back to him. That was the first thing he had said that reached past the immediate accusation. Evidence may clear my name, she said. It cannot make your words wrong. They were wrong before anyone knew who carried that taper. I know. He lowered his voice. I couldn't sleep because I knew that before the footman found me. Silence settled between them. It was not comfortable, but neither of them tried to escape it. Richard's hands remained at his sides. He made no move to offer protection, money, carriage, or residence. Grace noticed the restraint because she knew what effort it cost powerful men not to solve other people's lives aloud. What do you intend to do with the footman's statement? She asked. Nothing without your agreement. She looked at him more sharply. Nothing. I can ask him to repeat it before a proper witness. I can ensure Sir James doesn't dismiss him before he's heard. I can ask my solicitor how best to preserve what he says. But if you want no involvement from me, I'll accept that. You would walk away. From interfering where I'm not wanted, yes, not from correcting what I did publicly when the time comes. That answer unsettled her more than command would have. Mrs. Harcourt poured more tea. Without looking up, Grace crossed to the mantel, keeping the width of the rug between herself and Richard. There is something else. Richard waited. He did not ask until she continued. 4 days before the fire, on the 10th of May, I saw a Flemish verdure panel taken down from the upper gallery. Lady Atherstone looked up. Richard's expression changed from remorse to concentration. Taken down for cleaning? That is what I assumed. It was rolled and carried out through the servants' entrance. By whom? A carrier I did not know. One of Sir James's men supervised. Did Sir James tell you where it was going? No. Grace folded her hands loosely in front of her. It mattered only because Diana objected to the bare wall. She said, the room looked shabby without it. I remember telling her it would probably return before Lady Marchwood's visit. Richard was silent. Grace watched understanding gather in his face. Why does that matter now? He asked. Although his tone suggested, he already sensed the answer. Because Sir James spoke last night about the cost of what had been lost upstairs. He mentioned paintings, draperies, and the verdure panel. Richard's eyes narrowed. You're certain? Entirely. And the panel left the house 4 days before the fire. Yes, Grace glanced toward the hallway where the plum silk parasol stood beyond the open parlor door, exactly where she had placed it. If my uncle later claims that panel was destroyed in the fire, then the fire will not be the only thing in Beckett House that requires explaining. By the following afternoon, Grace was standing again inside Beckett House. But the house no longer felt like a place that had any claim upon her. She had returned because the fire office surveyor was coming to inspect the damaged rooms, and because she had decided that if her name was to be attached to the fire, then her own account would be attached to it as well. Mrs. Harcourt accompanied her in a dark blue carriage and remained beside her when the front door opened. The butler's expression changed at the sight of Grace, though whether from surprise, pity, or discomfort she could not tell. "Miss Beckett," he said, "Sir James is upstairs with the gentleman from the fire office." "Then we shall join them," Grace replied. She did not ask whether she was welcome. The upper corridor still carried the faint bitter odor of burned cloth. The worst of the wet had dried, but pale stains remained across the floorboards where water had been thrown during the fire. The damaged dressing room looked smaller in daylight. One curtain had been removed entirely. The other hung blackened along one edge. A section of wall covering had curled from the heat, and the carpet beneath the dressing table was dark with soot. The brass night taper stand still lay where Grace had seen it after the fire, though someone had placed it upright upon a clean square of cloth. Its small base was heat-marked. The intertwined letters DB were still visible beneath the soot. Richard stood near the window with his widowed aunt. He bowed when Grace entered. Nothing in his expression demanded that she acknowledge more than courtesy, and she was grateful for that. Sir James was speaking to the surveyor, a compact man with spectacles and a leather portfolio tucked under one arm. "The principal damage is confined to this chamber," Sir James said, "though naturally we shall need to account for the objects destroyed or rendered useless." The surveyor glanced toward Grace. "Miss Beckett?" Sir James answered before she could. "My niece was unfortunately involved in the matter." Richard's gaze shifted toward him. He said nothing. Grace stepped forward. "I was in this room before supper to collect a pair of gloves for Miss Diana Beckett. I left before the fire began." The surveyor opened his portfolio. "And did you light or handle the taper?" "No," Sir James gave a short breath of impatience. "Grace, we have already discussed this. You accused me," she said. "That is not the same as discussing it." Mrs. Harcourt made the smallest sound in her throat, almost like approval disguised as a cough. The surveyor looked at the taper stand. "Who owns this?" Diana had appeared in the doorway behind her father. Her face was composed, but Grace saw her fingers tighten against the folds of her pale morning gown. "It's mine," Diana said. "I keep it on the dressing table." "Was it there when you left the room before supper?" The pause was brief. "I don't remember." Grace turned her eyes toward Diana. The answer was careful enough to matter. The surveyor crouched without touching the object. "And the initials correspond to your name?" "Yes." Sir James stepped closer. "Surely that proves only ownership." "It doesn't tell us who lit the taper." "I did not say that it did," the surveyor replied mildly. He made several notes, then asked the butler to fetch a clean box and paper. "I will retain this temporarily with the rest of the fire office materials. You will receive a written acknowledgement." Sir James frowned. "Is that necessary?" "It is prudent." Grace watched as the brass stand was lifted with cloth rather than bare fingers, wrapped, placed inside the box, and sealed under the surveyor's supervision. She fixed the movement in her mind. From that moment, the taper no longer remained in Diana's dressing room. It passed into the surveyor's custody. Richard noticed Grace watching. Their eyes met for a moment, but he did not speak. The surveyor continued through the room, asking about scorched draperies, damaged carpet, a cracked mirror, and several smaller furnishings. Grace answered only when questioned. Richard did the same. Twice Sir James attempted to explain her movements for her. Twice Grace corrected him without raising her voice. By the time they moved into the adjoining gallery, the atmosphere had shifted. She was no longer merely the niece who had left in disgrace. She was a witness whose account was being written down. The gallery wall looked strangely bare on its eastern side. 4 faint marks showed where hooks had held a large hanging. Grace stopped there. There is something else that should be recorded. The surveyor looked up from his notes. What is that? A Flemish verdure panel hung here until the 10th of May. Sir James turned sharply. Grace, she continued. I saw it removed that morning. It was rolled and taken through the servants' entrance by a carrier. One of Sir James's household men supervised. Surveyor glanced at the empty wall. Was it sent for cleaning? I assumed so at the time. I was not told. You are mistaken, Sir James said. Grace faced him. About seeing it removed. About the date. The panel was still in the house later than that. No, you cannot possibly be certain. I am. His expression hardened. Based on what? Grace had expected the question. Lady Marchwood was expected to call on the 14th. Diana complained that morning that the wall looked shabby without the panel. I told her it would probably be returned before the visit. She said she hoped so because the empty hooks made the gallery look neglected. Diana's face lost a little color. I don't remember saying that. I do. Sir James looked toward Richard as though expecting him to intervene. Richard remained where he was. The silence was deliberate. Grace understood what he was doing. 2 days earlier, he might have answered for her, wielded his title, or convert her observation into something important because a duke repeated it. Now he simply allowed her words to stand in the room on their own weight. The surveyor wrote for several seconds. You saw the panel physically carried out. Yes. Do you know the carrier? No. Did you see its destination? No. Then I will record only what you personally observed. That is all I ask. Sir James gave a humorless laugh. This is becoming absurd. The fire damaged half the upper floor, and now Grace wishes to create mysteries out of household furnishings. Grace looked at the empty hooks. I wish only to prevent something from being counted as destroyed if it was not here to burn. The surveyor's pen stopped. Sir James stared at her. And who has said it will be counted as destroyed? For the first time since returning, Grace felt the room grow completely still. Sir James had not yet submitted the formal written schedule of losses. Richard knew that. Grace knew that. The surveyor knew only what had been stated today. Grace turned slowly toward her uncle. You mentioned the panel on the night of the fire when speaking of what had been lost upstairs. I mentioned many things in confusion. Then there should be no difficulty. The surveyor closed one page and opened another. For clarity, Sir James, do you intend to include the verdure panel among the claimed losses? A muscle moved in Sir James's jaw. Diana looked at the floor. Yes, he said at last. I believe it was destroyed. Grace did not look at Richard. She did not need to. The empty wall before her was enough. Then please record my statement in my own name, she said. The surveyor inclined his head. I will. Sir James turned away, but Grace remained where she was until the final words had been written. Only then did she leave the gallery with Mrs. Harcourt beside her. Behind them, the surveyor reminded Sir James that the first written schedule of losses was due the next day. On the morning of the 17th of May, The first written schedule of losses from Beckett House arrived at Mrs. Harcourt's breakfast table, folded beneath a note from the fire office surveyor. Grace knew what she would find before she opened it, but knowledge did not lessen the small shock of seeing the words set down in ink. Carpets, draperies, a pier glass, 2 upholstered chairs, several gowns. Then, midway down the second page, one entry stopped her completely. Flemish verdure wall panel, destroyed by fire. Grace read it twice. Mrs. Harcourt watched from across the table. Is it there? Yes. Grace laid the paper flat. Sir James has claimed the panel burned. And you saw it leave the house 4 days earlier. I did. The certainty in her own voice steadied her. That was the difference between memory and suspicion. She had not glimpsed the object through smoke. She had watched 2 men carry the rolled panel toward the servants' entrance in clear morning light on the 10th of May. One had complained about its weight. The other had laughed and told him to mind the lower edge. Diana had complained afterward about the bare hooks. Those facts existed, whether Sir James liked them or not. A carriage stopped outside. Mrs. Harcourt glanced toward the window. Your Duke is punctual. Grace looked up. He is not my Duke. No. The widow's mouth twitched. That appears to be one of the lessons he is learning. Richard arrived with Lady Atherstone, and, a few minutes later, the fire office surveyor joined them carrying his leather portfolio. The soot-blackened brass taper stand did not come with him. Grace noticed the absence immediately and was relieved by it. The object remained where it belonged, in fire office custody, rather than traveling casually from conversation to conversation. The surveyor opened his portfolio and placed a clean copy of Sir James's schedule beside the note already on the table. This is the declaration received yesterday, he said. I thought it proper that Miss Beckett should see the entry concerning the panel, given her recorded statement. Richard did not reach for the paper. Miss Beckett? Grace appreciated the question more than she wanted to. I have read it. The surveyor nodded. Sir James maintains that the panel was still inside Beckett House on the evening of the 14th. It was not. Can you identify the men who removed it? Not by name. Grace paused, but perhaps by circumstance. Richard's gaze settled on her. He did not interrupt. Grace looked at the simple floor sketch the surveyor had made of the upper rooms and service passage. The panel did not go through the front hall. It was carried down the back staircase and out through the servants' entrance. I followed partway because Diana had asked whether the wall would be rehung before Lady Marchwood's visit. You followed the panel? The surveyor asked. Only as far as the lower passage. I saw it carried through the door. There was a cart waiting beyond. A private cart? No, at least I do not think so. Grace closed her eyes for one moment, not to dramatize memory, but to strip it of everything unnecessary. Damp stones, a grey horse, a narrow cart. One of the men wore a brown coat with a patched elbow. The driver had spoken to a Beckett groom near the mews. It was hired, she said. From the mews, I believe. One of the Beckett grooms was speaking with the driver as they brought the panel out. Richard leaned slightly toward the sketch. Which entrance? Grace reached toward the lower corner of the page at the same moment he did. Their gloved fingers touched. It was nothing, barely a brush through kid leather, yet both of them stopped. Grace became sharply aware of the narrow space between them, of Richard's hand withdrawing at once, and of the fact that he did not disguise the moment by reaching again. His eyes lifted to hers. Something quiet passed there. Not apology this time, not protection, awareness. Grace looked back to the sketch before the silence acquired more meaning than either of them had earned. "Here," she said, touching the lower passage with one finger. Richard kept his hand at his side. The cart stood beyond that door. The surveyor made a note. Would the groom remember who was hired? Possibly. Richard looked at Grace, rather than at the surveyor. "What do you want done next?" The question caught her off guard, because 3 days earlier he would almost certainly have phrased it differently. "What shall I do? Or worse, leave this to me," Grace considered before answering. "Find the carrier. Through the Beckett groom, if he will speak, or through the nearby mews. A regular driver may be known there." Richard nodded. "And if he is found?" "We ask where he took the panel. We do not tell him what answer we want." Agreed. The surveyor closed the schedule. "That would be useful. If the panel was removed before the fire, the question of its destination becomes material to the claim." Mrs. Harcourt poured tea for Lady Atherstone, making no attempt to hide that she had listened to every word. "I confess," she said, "I find it remarkable that Sir James would list something so large if there were men who carried it from his house." Grace looked at the written entry again. "He may believe the men cannot be found." Richard's expression hardened, though not at her. "Or cannot be persuaded to remember." Grace met his eyes. "Then we had better reach them before anyone persuades them otherwise." By noon, Richard had sent one of his own servants to make discreet inquiries at the mews behind Beckett House. Grace refused his first suggestion that the man carry a ducal card. If he arrives announcing the Duke of Ormskirk's interest, everyone will decide what story they think His Grace wants. Richard accepted the correction immediately. No card, then. No pressure. No pressure. It should not have mattered that he repeated the condition without irritation. It did. Late that afternoon, Richard returned to Bloomsbury with news. This time he did not enter until Mrs. Harcourt's maid confirmed Grace would receive him. Lady Atherstone remained in the adjoining room with the door open. Richard stood rather than taking a chair. The groom remembered the driver, he said, not his full name. He called him Ned. The man usually took hired work from a small stand behind the western mews. Grace felt the first stir of hope. Usually, Richard's mouth tightened. He has not been there for several days. Since before the fire, no one could say with certainty, only that he has left his usual stand. Grace walked to the window. The answer was frustrating, but not final. She forced herself back through the 10th of May again. The cart, the rolled green panel, the groom's voice, the driver adjusting the rope. Then another detail surfaced, so ordinary she had dismissed it at the time. The carrier had complained that if they delayed him much longer, he would miss another collection. The Beckett groom had laughed and told him that Bond Street would still be there when he arrived. Grace turned from the window. Richard saw the change in her face. "What is it?" "Bond Street." "What about it?" The driver mentioned another collection. The groom told him Bond Street would still be there. Richard's attention sharpened. "You think that was his next destination?" "Perhaps, or where he had come from. I don't know." Grace reached for the lost schedule again and placed one finger beside the line, declaring the verdure panel destroyed. "But we know one thing Sir James appears to be counting on." Richard waited. "That no one will follow the route of something he says no longer exists." The next morning, Grace began with the servants' entrance rather than Bond Street, because memory alone was not enough when memory had already been called invention. Mrs. Harcourt's maid had found her at breakfast, with a sheet of foolscap covered in small, careful notes. Grace had reconstructed the 10th of May from the details no one had considered important at the time. Diana had complained about the empty gallery wall before noon. 2 men had carried the rolled verdure panel down the back stairs. One wore a brown coat patched at the elbow. A Beckett groom had spoken to the driver near the mews. The cart had narrow wheels, darkened by recent rain. And the driver had grumbled about losing time before another collection. Bond Street had been mentioned. Grace did not know whether it was the carrier's next destination, his previous one, or merely somewhere he expected to pass. But it was a thread. She intended to pull it carefully. Richard arrived shortly after 10 with Lady Atherstone, not because Grace had summoned him, but because Mrs. Harcourt had sent word the previous evening that Grace wished to continue the inquiry. He listened while Grace read through the sequence. When she finished, he asked only, "Where do you want to begin?" The question had become less startling, though she still noticed it. At the mews. If the driver was hired locally, someone may know where he takes regular work. Richard nodded. "Then we'll start there." They travelled in Lady Atherstone's carriage, with the older woman seated opposite them, and the city moving past in bright May light. Grace watched shop fronts, carts, gentlemen on horseback, and servants carrying parcels beneath signs she had passed 100 times without seeing. London had always seemed full of people who knew where things went. That morning, the city felt like a vast collection of unnoticed witnesses. The inquiry at the mews took nearly an hour. The Beckett groom was willing to confirm that a hired carrier had collected a rolled wall hanging on the 10th, though his recollection of the man's name was uncertain. "Ned something, miss, or perhaps Edward. He takes odd jobs when the regular men are full." Grace asked whether the carrier had been given the destination in his hearing. The groom scratched his jaw. "No, miss. Sir James's man gave him the instructions before I came out." "Which man?" "Mr. Hollis, the upper footman." "Did Mr. Hollis travel with the cart?" "No. He watched them load it and went back inside." Richard stood half a pace behind Grace. The groom glanced toward him more than once, clearly aware of the Duke's presence, but Richard did not speak. Grace asked, "Did the carrier say where he was going afterward?" The groom frowned, thinking. "He complained he'd another call near Bond Street and would be late if we kept him." Grace felt the answer settle into place. "Near Bond Street. Not necessarily with our panel." "No, miss. Could been another job." "Thank you. That distinction matters." The groom looked faintly surprised that she had said so. They found the carrier 2 streets away from his usual stand, repairing a wheel beside a narrow yard. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 40s, with a weathered face and a brown coat patched at one elbow. Grace recognized him before he recognized her. Richard saw the recognition and said quietly, "You should speak first." She looked at him. "I intended to." "I know." The smallest warmth passed through her before she could prevent it. The carrier straightened when he saw Richard's clothes and carriage, then immediately looked wary. Grace stepped forward before Rank could shape the man's answer. "Were you hired on the 10th of May to collect a rolled wall hanging from Beckett House in Mayfair?" The man's eyes narrowed. "Might been. A large verdure panel. 2 men were needed to carry it." "I remember that. Where did you take it?" He glanced toward Richard. Grace said, "Please look at me. His Grace is not asking the question." The carrier did. "Bond Street, miss." Her pulse quickened, but she kept her voice even. "To whom?" "A dealer. Mr. Vale's establishment. Fine furnishings, pictures, tapestries. I don't know his Christian name." "Were you told who owned the panel?" "No. I was told to collect it from Beckett House and deliver it to Vale's receiving entrance." Who gave the order? A servant at Beckett House. Tall fellow. Dark hair. Grace thought of Hollis. Did Sir James Beckett speak to you personally? No, miss. Did anyone tell you the panel was being cleaned? No. Did anyone say it was being sold? No. The carrier shifted his weight. I just move what I'm paid to move. And you moved that panel 4 days before the fire? Yes, miss. Richard spoke for the first time. Would you be willing to repeat that before the fire office surveyor? The carrier's expression tightened. Grace saw the fear instantly. Men like him lived by regular work and other men's willingness to recommend them. A dispute involving a baronet and a duke could cost more than a week's wages. You are not required to decide now, Grace said. Richard looked at her, then back at the carrier. Miss Beckett is right, the man exhaled. I'll think on it. Grace thanked him and turned away. She had taken 3 steps when he called after her. Miss. She stopped. There was one thing. Yes? The gentleman's servant told me to be careful with the lower edge, said it had been repaired recently and they didn't want the stitching strained. Grace absorbed the detail without yet understanding why it felt important. Thank you. Back in the carriage, Lady, Atherstone said, you have established that the panel left Beckett House and reached Bond Street before the fire. We have established that a carrier says so, Grace corrected. We have not yet established that Mr. Vale still has it or what happened after delivery. Richard looked out the window. You're determined not to overstate a single fact. I have had enough people do that for me. His gaze returned to her. Fair. The Bond Street dealer received them reluctantly in a private room behind his showroom. Mr. Vale was a narrow man with silver at his temples and the guarded politeness of someone accustomed to aristocrats, asking questions that could damage trade. Grace explained only what was necessary. A Flemish verdure panel was delivered here from Beckett House on the 10th of May. I need to know whether it arrived. Mr. Vale folded his hands. I do not discuss a client's affairs without cause. Richard could have ended the resistance with rank. Grace saw the possibility in the dealer's face. Richard saw it too. He did nothing. The panel has been listed as destroyed in a fire that occurred 4 days after the delivery, Grace said. I am not asking you to reveal a price, a purchaser, or a debt, only whether the same object reached your premises before the fire. Mr. Vale's eyes shifted toward Richard. Your Grace. Richard answered, Miss Beckett should answer that. Grace turned toward him before she could stop herself. The sentence was simple, yet it landed with more force than a declaration of support would have. He was not lending her his authority. He was refusing to absorb hers. Mr. Vale looked back at Grace. I understand your position, he said slowly, but I still require a proper reason before discussing property placed in my care. Then tell me what would constitute one. A formal inquiry from the fire office would be sufficient, or written authority from the owner. Grace almost smiled at the second possibility. The owner is unlikely to help. Then the fire office. She inclined her head. Thank you, that is useful. Outside, Bond Street was crowded with carriages and shoppers. A gentleman Grace recognized from Lady Marchwood's circle approached Richard near the curb. Ormskirk, I heard you've been occupied with the Beckett affair. What have you discovered? Richard's eyes went first to Grace. Then he said, Miss Beckett should answer that. The gentleman blinked. Grace felt something unexpected move through her. Not gratitude, something quieter and more dangerous. She met the man's curious gaze. Only that a carrier confirms the missing panel left Beckett House 4 days before the fire. We do not yet know what happened to it afterward. The gentleman nodded slowly, listening to her rather than looking past her. As their carriage drew away, Grace looked once at Richard. He did not ask whether she had noticed what he had done. That, more than the gesture itself, made it matter. Yet, the mystery had tightened rather than loosened. The carrier had delivered the panel to Bond Street. Mr. Vale had not denied receiving it, and tomorrow Sir James intended to gather influential witnesses for the preliminary fire loss assessment. If the panel could not be traced beyond Mr. Vale's guarded door, Grace's truth would remain a route with no destination. That evening, Grace entered Ormskirk House for the first time, without wondering whether she had been invited because of pity. Lady Atherstone had sent a formal note to Mrs. Harcourt requesting Grace's company for tea, and Mrs. Harcourt had accepted on the understanding that she would accompany her. The arrangement was proper enough to satisfy the strictest observer, yet Grace understood that the true purpose lay neither in tea nor courtesy. Richard wished to speak with her before Sir James gathered witnesses the next day, and this time he had asked rather than arranged. Ormskirk House possessed the restrained grandeur Grace would have expected from a duke who disliked unnecessary display. The drawing room overlooked a small rear garden, and beyond it a conservatory stood open to the evening air. Lady Atherstone and Mrs. Harcourt settled near the long windows with their tea, while Richard asked Grace whether she would walk as far as the conservatory. The doors between the rooms remained open. Both older women were visible. From where he stopped beside a stone table, holding several pots of early geraniums, Grace appreciated the care he had taken with propriety, though she did not tell him so. "You wanted to speak before tomorrow," she said. "Yes." Richard looked toward the garden for a moment, then back at her. "Sir James intends to argue that you had a reason to damage Diana's room." Grace had expected something ugly. Still, the precision of the attack chilled her. What reason? Jealousy. She almost laughed, but there was nothing amusing in it. Of Diana's prospects. Richard's jaw tightened. Apparently, he means to suggest that my visits to Beckett House had encouraged rivalry between you. Your visits were to my uncle. Some of them. Grace looked at him. He did not look away. The air changed subtly between them. It would have been easy, and perhaps pleasant, to let the implications stand. Grace refused the temptation. Whatever you noticed or did not notice about me before the fire cannot become my defense tomorrow. I know. His answer was immediate. If I say I preferred your company to Diana's, Sir James will only claim that preference gave you more reason to resent her. Exactly. Then I will not give him that weapon. Grace studied him. A week earlier, she might have expected a duke to consider his feelings powerful enough to settle the matter. Richard was learning that truth did not become cleaner merely because rank spoke it. "There is another reason I asked you here," he said. Grace waited. Richard's hands were clasped loosely behind his back. In the fading daylight, he appeared less like the unshakable man London knew, and more like someone holding himself upright through habit. "You asked me, at Mrs. Harcourt's house, why I said what I did that night. You answered." I answered the immediate question. His gaze lowered briefly. "I did not tell you why a challenge of honor frightens me enough to make me cruel." Grace felt her attention sharpen. "You do not owe me a history you do not wish to tell." "No, but if I ask you to judge whether I am changing, you should know what I have spent half my life hiding behind." He drew a breath. "My father died after a quarrel of honor when I was 17. Grace said nothing. Richard's voice remained controlled, but the control had lost its coldness. The dispute began over something so small that no one could later explain why two intelligent men had allowed pride to make it larger. By the time anyone attempted to stop it, reputation had become more important than sense. My father did not return home. He looked toward the glass roof above them. I inherited the dukedom before I had learned how to manage my own temper, and I inherited every whisper attached to his death with it. Grace had heard vague references to an old Atherstone scandal, but never the truth beneath them. She remained still. For 23 years, Richard continued, I have treated public conflict as a fire that must be smothered before it grows. I learned to end arguments quickly. I learned to make men ashamed of continuing them. I learned to give society something else to talk about before it could choose its own story. His mouth tightened, and I became proud of how efficiently I could do it. Grace understood before he said the rest. So when Sir James asked whether you would quarrel with him over me, you saw your father. Yes. And you decided the safest way to stop him was to make me beneath the quarrel. Richard's expression did not change, but pain entered his eyes. Yes. Grace let the answer remain between them. The temptation to soften it for him was surprisingly strong. She resisted. Understanding was not absolution. Then you did not prevent a quarrel, she said quietly. You transferred its cost. Richard closed his eyes for one brief moment. To you, yes, I know. Do you? He looked at her again. I am beginning to. Grace turned toward the open doorway to the drawing room. Mrs. Harcourt was speaking to Lady Atherstone, deliberately not watching them. I can understand why the idea of a duel terrifies you, Grace said. I can even understand why your first instinct was to end the confrontation. But if fear makes you willing to humiliate someone else so you can feel that the danger has passed, then fear is still making your choices. Richard absorbed that without defense. You are right. No explanation followed. No claim that he had meant well. Grace felt something inside her loosens because he had not asked her to comfort him. I don't expect forgiveness merely because I've finally explained myself, he said. Good. A faint, almost weary smile touched his mouth. You have a talent for making that word sound deserved. It usually is. The smile disappeared, but warmth remained in his eyes. For several seconds, neither spoke. Grace became aware of how close they stood, though several feet still separated them. The intimacy came not from distance, but from the absence of performance. Richard had given her something London never saw from him. Not charm, not command, fear. She looked down at her gloved hands. One had tightened around the other without her noticing. Richard saw it. He did not move at once. Grace. It was the first time he had used her given name. Her eyes rose to his. He seemed to realize what he had done, but he did not retreat into formality. May I take your hand? The question moved through her more deeply than the accidental touch over the survey sketch had done. That had belonged to chance. This did not. Grace looked at his extended hand. He held it open between them, waiting. There was no assumption in the gesture, no demand that she reward confession with tenderness. She could refuse, and they both knew it. Slowly, Grace placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers with careful warmth. Nothing more. No pull toward him. No possessive pressure. Only contact freely offered and freely accepted. Richard's breath changed almost imperceptibly. Grace felt her own pulse quicken beneath the glove. Thank you, he said. Do not thank me as though I have granted forgiveness. I won't. His thumb remained still against the side of her hand. Then, what are you thanking me for? For trusting me with one moment I have not earned the right to ask twice." Grace held his gaze. Something dangerous and tender passed between them, quieter than desire and more difficult to dismiss. After a few seconds, she withdrew her hand. Richard released it immediately. The restraint mattered as much as the touch. A servant appeared at the conservatory entrance carrying a folded note on a tray. "Your Grace, this came from the fire office." Richard took it, opened it, and read. His expression hardened. "What is it?" Grace asked. He handed her the note rather than summarizing it. She read the short message herself. Sir James had confirmed the scope of the next day's preliminary assessment. He intended to present witnesses concerning Grace's supposed resentment of Diana and her presence in the dressing room before the fire. Grace folded the paper once. "So he means to make motive out of jealousy." "Yes," Richard watched her carefully. "What do you want from me tomorrow?" Grace looked at the hand that had held hers, then back at his face. "Do not save me from answering." Richard inclined his head. "I won't." By the morning of the 24th of May, Beckett House no longer smelled strongly of smoke, but the upper rooms still carried the dull stain of what had happened there. The preliminary fire loss assessment was held not in the drawing room, where Sir James preferred to command attention, but in the long gallery adjoining Diana's damaged dressing room. The fire office representative had requested access to the affected rooms, and Sir James had invited several men with financial interests in the household, along with 2 guests who had witnessed the first accusation. Grace understood why. Her uncle wanted an audience large enough to convert uncertainty into reputation. She arrived with Mrs. Harcourt. Richard came separately with Lady Atherstone. He greeted Grace with a bow and nothing more. The restraint steadied her. He had promised not to save her from answering, and she saw immediately that he intended to keep that promise. The soot-blackened brass taper stand was not present. It remained in fire office custody, exactly where it had been placed after the survey. The loss schedule lay on a table near the window. Beside it rested the surveyor's notes and a simple inventory of damaged furnishings. The Flemish verdure panel appeared again on Sir James's schedule as destroyed by fire. Grace looked at that line only once. She did not need to look twice. Sir James began politely. That was his most dangerous manner. "No one wishes to make this more unpleasant than necessary," he said. Grace almost admired the sentence. It transformed a public accusation into an inconvenience everyone ought to help him end. The fire office representative adjusted his spectacles. "Then perhaps we should confine ourselves to facts." "Gladly." Sir James turned toward Grace. "My niece was in Diana's dressing room shortly before the fire." Grace answered before anyone else could. "Yes." A murmur moved through the gallery. Sir James had expected denial. She saw it in his eyes. "You admit that. I have never denied it. Diana asked me to retrieve her gloves. I entered the room, found them, and left." Diana stood beside her father in a pale blue gown, composed enough to appear wounded rather than frightened. "You were angry with me that afternoon." Grace looked at her. "We disagreed. You said something about burning money." The room became quieter. Grace remembered the argument at once. Diana had ordered another length of embroidered silk despite Sir James's repeated complaints about household accounts. Grace had told her the expense was foolish. Diana had laughed. The words came back whole. Sir James spoke them for her. "At this rate, you might as well burn the money." He let the phrase settle. One of the creditors shifted near the window. Diana lowered her eyes as though embarrassed to repeat family unpleasantness. She said it in the morning room, Diana added. She was angry because Father had spent so much on my season. Grace felt Richard's attention on her, but he remained silent. Good. She did not need him to deny a sentence she had actually spoken. I did say it, Grace replied. Sir James's expression sharpened with satisfaction. There, we are making progress, only if accuracy is progress. Grace kept her voice even. I said it because Diana had ordered another expensive gown after you had already complained about household expenditure. It was a metaphor, an unkind one, perhaps. It was not an intention to set fire to her dressing room. A faint flush touched Diana's face. You were jealous. Grace turned fully toward her cousin. Of what? Diana hesitated. Sir James answered. Of the attention Diana was receiving, of her prospects, of the fact that His Grace had been expected to look favorably upon her. Every eye in the gallery moved toward Richard. Grace felt the trap before it closed. If Richard now declared he had preferred Grace, Sir James would turn preference into motive. If Richard denied caring for either woman, he would repeat the wound he had already caused. Richard did neither. He looked at Grace and waited. The choice was hers. My uncle may speculate about my feelings, Grace said, but speculation does not place a taper beside a curtain. Sir James gave a short laugh. Nor does it remove you from the room. I have not asked to be removed from it. The fire office representative lifted one hand. Let us return to sequence. Miss Beckett, you entered the dressing room before supper. Yes. Did you light the taper? No. Did you see it burning? No. Did you touch the stand? No. Miss Diana Beckett, did you carry the stand upstairs that day, Diana's breath caught so slightly that most of the room might have missed it. Grace did not. I don't remember. The representative made a note. Sir James stepped in before the silence deepened. Memory after a fright is often imperfect. What is not imperfect is the fact that Grace was there and had expressed resentment toward Diana. Resentment is your word, Grace said, not mine. Then perhaps we should discuss the other invention you have offered. He touched the loss schedule, this absurd claim that the verdure panel had left the house before the fire. Grace felt the air in the room tighten. It did leave. You have no receipt. No written instruction. No dealer willing to confirm some. Not yet. Sir James turned toward the others, and nevertheless she would have us believe that an object listed among the losses somehow vanished beforehand, conveniently creating the impression that I have made a false claim. Richard remained still. Grace noticed the effort it cost him. His jaw had tightened, but he did not speak over her. Sir James looked back at Grace. When did you first decide the panel had been removed? The question was designed to imply invention. Grace answered it directly. I did not decide it. I saw it. And your proof? A carrier confirms that he collected a large rolled verdure panel from Beckett House on the 10th of May. That produced the first genuine shift in the room. One creditor looked toward the loss schedule. The fire office representative raised his head. Sir James's face did not change, but Diana's did. A carrier, Sir James repeated. A hired man who may have moved any number of household objects. He remembers the panel. Because you told him what to remember, Richard's hand moved once at his side. Grace saw it, and more importantly saw him stop himself, she answered. No. I asked what he collected. He described a large rolled wall hanging. He remembered being warned to take care with its lower edge. He confirmed the date. He confirmed that it was delivered toward Bond Street. Toward Bond Street, Sir James repeated, not proof of where it ended. No, Grace held his gaze. But if the panel burned here on the 14th, perhaps you can explain why a carrier removed it from this house on the 10th. Silence spread through the gallery. Not triumph, not yet, but doubt, the first clean fracture in Sir James's version. The fire office representative wrote something slowly. One of the creditors asked, "Sir James, was the panel sent out for sale or repair?" "Certainly not." "Then where was it?" "In the house." Grace said nothing. She did not need to. The contradiction was now his to carry. The assessment ended without resolution, but not without consequence. As the others began to leave, Grace saw Diana's maid waiting near the corridor. The girl had previously indicated, through Mrs. Harcourt's maid, that she was willing to speak about Diana's handling of the taper. Grace approached her quietly. "You wished to tell me something." The maid's face had gone pale. She glanced toward Diana, then toward Sir James. "I'm sorry, miss." "For what? I can't speak about it." Grace's stomach tightened. "Has someone threatened you?" "No, miss. The denial came too quickly. I just can't." She turned away before Grace could press further. Richard had seen the exchange. He came no closer than necessary. "What happened?" "She has changed her mind." "About speaking?" "Yes." Grace looked toward Diana. Her cousin was watching from the far end of the gallery. Then we find out why. Richard did not offer a solution. He only extended his arm as they reached the stairs. Grace looked at it for one heartbeat. Then, by her own choice, she placed her gloved hand upon his sleeve and walked out beside him. The maid's silence troubled Grace more than Sir James's accusations had, because fear rarely changed a person's mind without help. On the morning of the 25 May, Mrs. Harcourt arranged for the girl to enter by the kitchen door rather than the front, and Grace received her in the small back parlor where no Beckett servant could see who had called. The maid stood with both hands clasped so tightly that the knuckles showed pale beneath her skin. "You do not have to tell me anything," Grace said. "I mean that." The girl looked at her, startled. Miss Diana said I'd never have another respectable place if I contradicted her. Grace felt anger rise, clean and immediate, but she kept her voice quiet. "Did she say she would dismiss you?" "She said dismissal would be the kindest part. She said her father knows every household worth serving in." Mrs. Harcourt, seated near the window, made a soft sound of disapproval. Grace asked, "Did Sir James speak to you himself?" "No, miss." "Then do not say that he did." The maid swallowed. "No, miss. And I will not ask you to repeat anything publicly that could cost you your livelihood." Relief passed across the girl's face so swiftly that Grace nearly looked away. It hurt to see how little kindness a frightened servant expected. "But you had intended to speak before yesterday," Grace continued. "Was that because of the taper?" The maid nodded. "I saw Miss Diana take it upstairs before supper. I was in the passage when she passed me. That's all I know." "You did not see her light it?" "No, miss." "You did not see where she placed it?" "No." Grace inclined her head. "Then that is all it is. Something you saw, not proof of everything that followed." The girl's shoulders loosened. "Will you tell His Grace?" "Only that you have been pressured and that I will not use you against your will." "Thank you, miss." After she left, Grace remained standing beside the cold grate. Mrs. Harcourt watched her for several moments before saying, "You have just surrendered the easiest witness you possess." "No," Grace turned. "I have refused to make another woman pay for my vindication." The words settled heavily inside her because she understood exactly what they meant. Richard had humiliated her to stop a quarrel. Diana had threatened a servant to stop a contradiction. Sir James was trying to make the cost of his story fall on whoever had the least power to refuse it. Grace would not build her own justice on the same foundation. Richard arrived shortly before noon with Lady Atherstone. His expression changed when he saw Grace's face. What happened? She told him everything the maid had permitted her to tell. He listened without interrupting. When Grace finished, he said, "Then we do not ask her to testify." The answer came so quickly that she looked at him. "You agree, completely, even though her statement would help me, especially then." Something in his voice made Grace hold his gaze. Before she could answer, Lady Atherstone entered with a folded note that had been delivered to Ormskirk House and forwarded to Richard. "From Sir James," she said. Richard broke the seal and read. His mouth became a hard line. "What does he want?" Grace asked. He handed the note to her rather than summarizing it. Sir James had written with elaborate courtesy. He suggested that Richard's continued involvement in a household dispute was encouraging gossip and placing ducal dignity beside a woman whose evidence had become increasingly uncertain. There was no direct accusation. That made the insult more deliberate. Grace read the final sentence twice. A man in your Grace's position must surely know when persistence begins to resemble credulity. She returned the paper. He thinks the maid's withdrawal changes everything. It changes the strength of one piece of testimony, Richard said. Not what I know of you. Grace looked toward the window. Rain had begun to trace narrow lines across the glass. What do you know of me? Richard went still. She turned back to him. Not what you hope, not what you feel. What do you actually know? He did not answer immediately, and Grace respected him more for that than she would have respected a beautiful certainty invented on command. I know I humiliated you, he said. I know your account of that night has not changed once, even when changing it might have made people more comfortable. I know you have corrected details that would have helped you when they were not accurate. You corrected the carrier's Bond Street recollection. You refused to let the maid say more than she actually saw, and I know that I will not use uncertainty as permission to diminish you again. Grace's throat tightened. She forced herself to ask what still frightened her. If the evidence never becomes neat enough to save your reputation, will you decide I was not worth believing either? Lady Atherstone lowered her eyes. Mrs. Harcourt became very still. Richard did not look away from Grace. I cannot promise that every fact will prove what either of us expects, he said. I cannot claim knowledge I do not have, but I can promise this. I will not confuse uncertainty with your lack of worth. I will not repeat Sir James's judgment because society finds it convenient, and I will not withdraw merely because standing beside you becomes costly. Grace felt the answer before she trusted it. Even if the panel is never found, even then, even if the maid never speaks, even then, even if people say you are making a fool of yourself. A faint bitterness touched his expression. London has survived worse foolishness from dukes. Grace almost smiled. It vanished before becoming laughter, but Richard saw it. What will you say to Sir James? She asked. Nothing about you without your permission. You may tell him that you will not withdraw. Richard nodded. Only that, only that. He crossed to a writing desk, wrote a single line beneath Sir James's note, sanded it, and turned the page toward Grace before sealing it. Sir James, I will not withdraw. Ormskirk. No defense of her character, no threat, no claim of possession. Grace looked at him. Send it. He did. By late afternoon, the rain had stopped. Lady Atherstone and Mrs. Harcourt had moved into the front drawing room, leaving Grace and Richard at the small table in the back parlor with the door standing open between the rooms. The silence between them was not strained. They had exhausted the obvious routes. The carrier had established removal. Mr. Vale had refused disclosure without proper cause. The maid would not be sacrificed. Grace stared at the notes before her until the ink blurred slightly. We need proof that does not depend on her. Yes, Richard sat opposite her. What did the carrier say about the lower edge? Grace looked up. That the Beckett servant told him to be careful with it, because it had been repaired. The memory opened suddenly. Winter sunlight through the gallery. A workman kneeling beside the unrolled tapestry. Diana complaining that the new silk looked too green. Grace leaning down to inspect the patch because she had been the one asked to approve the household account afterward. The repair, she said. Richard waited. It was done last winter. The lower edge had split near one of the woven trees. An upholsterer patched it with green silk because matching the original thread was impossible. Her pulse quickened. He complained about the color. So did Diana. Would the upholsterer remember the panel if the silk was unusual enough? Richard leaned forward slightly. Then that is where we begin. Grace looked at her hands. For the first time that day, she felt tired rather than angry. Richard seemed to notice. He did not reach for her. Instead, he placed one hand on the table between them, palm upward, and waited. The gesture brought back the conservatory. But this was different. Then, he had asked for a brief touch after confession. Now he offered reassurance without words and left every decision with her. Grace looked at his open hand for several seconds. Then she placed hers in it. Richard's fingers closed gently around hers. Neither of them moved away. They remained joined, while rainwater slipped from the eaves outside, and the next step of the mystery slowly became clear. We find the upholsterer, Grace said, and we do it without asking the maid for anything more. Richard's thumb rested motionless against her glove. Agreed. Grace tightened her fingers once around his. Then tomorrow, we look for a green silk patch. On the morning of the 28th May, Grace stood outside a narrow upholsterer's shop off Oxford Street, with a notebook in one hand and the memory of a green silk patch lodged more firmly in her mind than any accusation Sir James had made. The intervening 2 days had produced no further help from Diana's maid, and Grace had kept her promise not to seek it. Instead, she had worked backward through the household accounts she remembered approving during the winter. A repaired tapestry had required silk. Silk had required a tradesman. A tradesman, unlike frightened servants, had no reason to fear Diana's future references. Mrs. Harcourt had accompanied her in Lady Atherstone's carriage, and Richard stood beside the step while his aunt waited inside. Grace carried her plum silk parasol despite the thin cloud overhead. She had begun to notice that she reached for it whenever she needed the reassurance of something chosen entirely by herself. Richard did not comment on it. He had also, Grace suspected, begun to understand that the most meaningful forms of restraint often looked like doing nothing at all. The upholsterer was a wiry man named Mr. Pritchard, who wore spectacles low on his nose, and regarded Grace with the cautious attention of someone deciding whether memory might become trouble. A Flemish verdure panel from Beckett House, Grace said. You repaired its lower edge last winter. Mr. Pritchard frowned. I repair a great many hangings, miss. This one had a split near the woven trunk of an ash tree. You patched it with green silk that did not quite match the original. His expression changed, too bright. Grace felt a quiet jolt of recognition. Yes, I remember that one. He set down the length of braid he had been measuring. Lady said the color offended her. Miss Diana Beckett. That's right. Do you remember why you used that particular silk? Because matching thread of that age is no simple matter. The old green had faded toward olive. New silk shows itself. He gave a small shrug. Better a visible repair than a widening tear. Grace glanced toward Richard. He remained slightly behind her, silent. Did anyone from Beckett House contact you about the panel after the repair? Mr. Pritchard scratched one eyebrow. There was a question some months later. What sort of question? Whether the repair would hold if the panel were rolled. Grace's fingers tightened around her notebook. When was that? Not long before the fire, I think. I'd have to check my book for the exact day. Who asked? A servant came. Tall fellow, dark hair, brought no panel with him. Just asked whether the patched edge would strain if rolled tight. Grace thought of Hollis, the upper footman, who had supervised the carrier. What did you tell him? That it depended on how it was rolled. I said the repaired edge should face outward and not be folded into the center. Richard finally spoke. Would you be willing to confirm that before the fire office representative if asked? Mr. Pritchard looked at him, then at Grace. Is this about the claim? Grace answered, before Rank could settle the matter for her. It may be. The panel has been listed as destroyed in the fire. But a carrier says he removed it from Beckett House 4 days earlier. Mr. Pritchard's face lost its casual expression. Destroyed? That is what Sir James Beckett has declared. Then someone had better find where it went. That is what we are trying to do. He hesitated, then reached for a ledger beneath the counter. After turning several pages, he stopped. Here, repair completed in January. Green silk supplied by Mercer and Lowe. His finger moved down. And here, 11th of May, inquiry from Beckett's servant regarding rolling and transport. Grace looked at the date. 1 day after she had seen the panel leave the house. Would you permit the fire office to see that entry? I would. The answer loosened something in her chest. It was not proof of the panel's destination, but it was another independent thread, joining the tapestry, to removal and transport rather than fire. Outside, the clouds had thinned. Lady Atherstone suggested they continue directly to Bond Street before Mr. Vale could find another reason to refuse them. Grace agreed. By the time they reached the dealer's establishment, the street had filled with carriages and fashionable shoppers. Grace descended, holding her notebook, folded notes, and parasol all at once. She nearly dropped the notebook when a gust caught the silk canopy. Richard instinctively reached toward it, then stopped before taking anything from her. Grace saw the hesitation. It made her decision easy. Would you hold this? She asked. She offered him the plum silk parasol. For one heartbeat, Richard looked almost surprised. Then he took it carefully. Their hands met at the handle. The contact was brief, warmer than it ought to have felt through gloves, and entirely chosen by her. Of course, he said. There was no smile that turned the gesture into flirtation. No teasing remark about a duke carrying a lady's parasol. He simply held it while Grace gathered her notes. That mattered more than she had expected. Mr. Vale received them with the same guarded courtesy as before, though his expression sharpened when Grace placed Mr. Pritchard's written memorandum and ledger reference on the table. You said you required proper cause before discussing property placed in your care, she said. I now have a carrier who confirms delivery from Beckett House before the fire, and an upholsterer who can identify a distinctive repair on the panel. Mr. Vale read the short memorandum, a green silk patch. At the lower edge, beside a woven ash tree, He looked toward Richard. Richard said nothing. Grace continued. I am not asking you to reveal a private client's finances. I am asking whether a panel with that identifying repair entered your premises before the 14th May. Mr. Vale tapped one finger against the paper. You understand that if I speak carelessly, I damage my trade. I do, and if I refuse, you may ask the fire office to request the information formally. Yes, which would put the matter into a record broader than this conversation. Grace met his gaze. That is not a threat. No, Mr. Vale gave the faintest nod. Which is why I believe you. He rose. Wait here. He disappeared through a rear door. Grace exhaled slowly. Richard stood near the wall, still holding the parasol. You can give that back now, she said. He crossed the room and offered it handle first. Grace took it. Again their gloves touched, but this time Richard released the handle immediately. Thank you, she said, for carrying it, for only carrying it. Understanding moved quietly across his face. You're welcome. Mr. Vale returned several minutes later with a clerk. There is a panel in the back room, he said. It arrived before the fire. I am willing to let Miss Beckett inspect it, but it does not leave my custody. Grace's pulse quickened. That is all I need. The back room smelled of wood, dust, and old fabric. Several rolled carpets leaned against one wall. On a long table lay a large bundle wrapped in canvas and tied with cord. Grace stopped 3 feet away. The size was right. The age-darkened edge of the covering looked familiar, but familiarity was not proof. Mr. Vale nodded to his clerk. The man loosened the first knot. Richard remained beside the doorway. Grace realized he had positioned himself there deliberately, close enough to accompany her, but far enough that no one could later claim the Duke had directed what she saw. The second knot opened. The canvas folded back. A strip of woven green appeared beneath it. Grace stepped closer, her breath suddenly shallow. Mr. Vale lifted the lower edge just enough for the repair to show. There, beside the woven trunk of an ash tree, was a patch of silk slightly too bright for the faded verdure around it. The green patch was there. 2 days later, Grace returned to Mr. Vale's Bond Street establishment with the fire office representative, Mr. Pritchard, the upholsterer, and Richard, not because she doubted what she had seen, but because seeing a green silk patch and proving what that patch meant were not the same thing. Mr. Vale had agreed to a second inspection only after receiving a formal request connected to the loss claim, and he remained visibly uneasy as the group followed him into the back room, where the large rolled verdure panel still rested under canvas. It has not left my custody, he said before anyone asked. Not since it was delivered. Grace looked at the bundle. She had spent the previous night remembering every line of the tapestry as it had hung at Beckett House. Dark trees, a stag near a stream, a faded hill beneath a sky that had once been blue, yet the image that mattered now was not the woven scene. It was the bright strip of repair silk at the lower edge. Mr. Vale nodded to his clerk, who loosened the cord. The panel opened only far enough to reveal the repaired section. Mr. Pritchard stepped forward. That is my work. The fire office representative asked, You are certain? Entirely. I used green silk from Mercer and Lowe because the old thread could not be matched. I remember the piece because Miss Diana Beckett disliked the color, Grace said. She said it made the repair more obvious. Mr. Pritchard glanced at her. Yes, miss, that's what she said. The representative wrote the statement carefully. Richard remained near the door. He had learned, Grace realized, where to place himself in these rooms, close enough to be present, far enough that his title did not swallow every answer. Mr. Vale moved to a small desk and opened a trade ledger. "There is more," he said. Grace looked at him. "You are willing to show it. Only what concerns the date and the nature of the delivery." His finger moved down a page. The panel arrived on the 10th of May. The representative leaned closer. "From Beckett House?" "Yes." "By whose authority?" Mr. Vale hesitated. "Sir James Beckett's household sent it. The accompanying note authorized me to hold the panel against an obligation owed to my establishment and another creditor with whom I conduct business." Grace felt the room contract around the words. "Against a debt," Mr. Vale inclined his head, "as security. I was not asked to sell it immediately. And it was still here on the 14th. "It was. During the fire, yes. After the fire, yes. And ever since, yes." The representative closed his notebook halfway, then opened it again as though even he needed the gesture to absorb the simplicity of the contradiction. "Then the same panel listed by Sir James Beckett as destroyed by fire has remained in your custody since 4 days before the fire occurred." "That is correct." Grace stared at the tapestry. The truth was larger and quieter than she had expected. No dramatic forgery, no hidden compartment, no clever reconstruction. The object simply existed where Sir James had hoped no one would think to look. Richard's gaze found hers, but he did not smile. He understood that triumph was the wrong emotion. Mr. Vale folded the canvas back over the panel. "I will produce it at the final assessment, if the fire office requests it, provided it remains under my supervision." "That will be arranged," the representative said. "It should not be moved elsewhere before then." "It won't be." Grace heard the certainty and fixed it in her mind. The panel remained with Mr. Vale. It had not been taken by Richard, by the fire office, or by Grace. It would appear again only under the dealer's custody. Mr. Pritchard signed a brief confirmation of the repair. The representative recorded Mr. Vale's account of the date and purpose of delivery. Nothing more was required. The mystery had not become complicated. It had become finished. Outside, Bond Street glittered beneath a thin wash of afternoon sun. Grace should have felt relieved. Instead, by the time the carriage reached Mrs. Harcourt's house, she could barely speak. Mrs. Harcourt and Lady Atherstone went ahead into the front drawing-room, leaving the back parlour open and properly visible from the passage. Richard stopped near the door. "You have what you needed," he said. Grace removed her gloves slowly. "Yes, and Sir James cannot honestly maintain the panel burned." "No." Richard waited. Grace crossed to the window. The small Bloomsbury garden beyond it was bright with new leaves. For 3 weeks she had treated the matter as a problem that could be solved by patience. Follow the carrier, find the dealer, identify the repair, establish the date. She had been so intent upon the next fact that she had not allowed herself to consider what the facts meant about the man who had raised her in his house. He knew, she said. Richard did not pretend to misunderstand. Yes, he knew the panel was gone before the fire. He knew Diana had carried the taper upstairs. Even if he did not know exactly how the fire began, he knew enough to know that blaming me was convenient. Yes, Grace pressed her fingertips against the window frame. I spent 11 years keeping his household accounts when he did not want to read them. I remembered which servants had sick mothers. I knew when Diana's dressmaker had not been paid. I knew which creditor could be asked for another month without causing offense. When the house caught fire, I carried his servants downstairs. Her voice remained steady until the last sentence, and when he needed someone expendable, he chose me. Richard did not come closer. Grace. She turned. There was no command in his face, No promise to destroy Sir James, no grand declaration that Richard could repair what another man had done. Only grief for her, held carefully enough that she did not feel observed. That restraint broke something open. "I thought finding the panel would make me feel victorious," she said. "Instead, I feel foolish for ever believing usefulness could become love if I gave enough of it." Richard's expression tightened. "You were not foolish. Do not make me noble, either." "I won't." I stayed because being needed felt safer than asking whether I was wanted. The admission hurt more than the accusation ever had. Richard took one step toward her, then stopped. He did not raise his hands. "What do you need now?" Grace looked at him. The answer surprised her because it was not solitude. It was not strategy. It was not distance. She crossed the space between them herself. Richard's eyes widened slightly when she stepped into his arms. For one heartbeat, he did not move at all. Then his arms came around her with extraordinary care, one hand resting between her shoulders, the other at her upper back. He did not pull her closer than she had chosen. Grace closed her eyes. The embrace held no urgency. It carried relief, grief, and the strange safety of being comforted by a man who was not trying to decide what her pain should mean. "I am tired," she whispered. "I know. No, I don't think you do." His voice was quiet near her temple. "Then tell me." Grace breathed once, slowly. "I am tired of being valuable only when I solve something." Richard's arms tightened by the smallest degree, enough to answer without confining her, then do nothing, for a moment. She almost laughed against his coat. "That sounds impossible." "I have recently discovered that doing nothing can require considerable discipline." This time she did laugh, though softly. When Grace finally stepped back, Richard released her at once. Neither apologized for the embrace, neither pretended it had been accidental. The quiet between them had changed. A knock sounded from the hall. Mrs. Harcourt's maid entered carrying a folded note. "For Miss Beckett." Grace broke the seal. Sir James's handwriting was unmistakable. He had learned that the verdure panel had been found. He requested a private meeting before the final assessment, and promised that the entire matter could still be ended without further public embarrassment. Grace read the note twice, then handed it to Richard. He read only what she had chosen to show him. "What will you do?" he asked. Grace looked toward the doorway, then back at him. "I will hear what he thinks my silence is worth." On the 3rd of June, Sir James Beckett came to Mrs. Harcourt's house without Diana, without a solicitor, and without any trace of the indignation he had displayed in public. That alone told Grace how frightened he was. Mrs. Harcourt received him in the front drawing-room, where the doors remained open, and Lady Atherstone sat near the window with a piece of embroidery she had not once looked at. Richard was present as well, but Grace had asked him, before Sir James arrived, to say nothing unless she requested it. He had agreed without qualification. Sir James entered with the careful dignity of a man determined to behave as though he had chosen the circumstances. His coat was perfectly brushed. His gloves were new. Only the tiredness beneath his eyes betrayed how little control he actually possessed. He bowed to Grace. "You look well." "I am well. I am pleased to hear it." She did not offer him the comfort of pretending they were discussing her health. "You asked for a meeting." Sir James glanced toward Richard. "I had hoped this might be a family conversation." Grace remained standing. The accusation was not private. The Fire Office claim is not private. The consequences will not be private either. Sir James's mouth tightened. "Must His Grace be present for every word?" Grace looked at Richard. He did not move. He is here because I asked him to be. That silenced the objection. Sir James took the chair Mrs. Harcourt indicated and rested his gloves across one knee. Very well, I will be plain. I have learned that the verdure panel has been located. Yes, and that Mr. Vale is prepared to produce it. Yes, then there is no purpose in prolonging this unpleasantness. Grace almost admired the phrasing. What do you propose? I will withdraw the disputed portion of the claim. The disputed portion? The panel, certain associated items, if necessary, and the accusation against me. Sir James spread one hand. That can be corrected. How? I can make it known that emotions were high after the fire and that conclusions were reached too quickly. Grace felt something cold settle in her chest. Whose conclusions? Grace, do not make this more difficult than it needs to be. You accused me of negligence before guests, servants, creditors, and the Duke of Ormskirk. Diana implied I had acted from jealousy. You used a sentence I once spoke about household extravagance as evidence of malice. Which of those things will you correct? Sir James looked toward Mrs. Harcourt as if appealing to a more reasonable woman. The widow did not help him. I will say there was a misunderstanding. There was no misunderstanding about the panel. His face hardened. No one was harmed by the claim. Grace stared at him. You mean no one whose losses you count? Do not be melodramatic. You used my reputation because it was cheaper than surrendering your claim. Sir James rose abruptly, then seemed to remember where he was, and sat again. I am offering you a way out. Out of what? Scandal. Exposure. Diana can leave London for a time. I will say publicly that you acted with courage during the fire. I will make certain no one questions your place in the family again. Grace felt, unexpectedly, nothing. For 11 years that final promise would have hurt. Now it sounded merely small. My place in the family. Yes, you mean Beckett House, naturally. The house you allowed me to leave under accusation. Sir James exhaled. You left by choice. Yes, and I am grateful now that I did. His eyes narrowed. What do you want? The question came without warmth, as though every human conflict could be solved once the price was identified. Grace answered slowly. I want the truth stated where the lie was allowed to stand. That is unnecessary, not to me. You would humiliate Diana. Diana helped humiliate me. She was frightened. So was I. Sir James leaned forward. If this reaches a final public assessment, people will know more than the origin of the fire. They will ask why the panel was placed with Vale. They will ask about my accounts. They will ask about debts that are none of their concern. You should have considered that before listing property you knew had not burned. For the first time, anger stripped away his politeness. After everything I have done for you. Grace felt the old reflex rise, the instinct to calculate the meals, rooms, introductions, and years of shelter. Then she remembered the night of the fire. She remembered the servants looking to her for direction, and her uncle looking for someone to blame. You gave me a home, she said. I gave that home 11 years of unpaid work, loyalty, discretion, and competence. We may call the account even. Sir James's face went still. Richard did not speak, but Grace felt his attention sharpen. So you refuse? Sir James asked. I refuse private peace purchased by leaving the public lie intact. And if I withdraw the claim entirely, then you will have corrected a financial falsehood. You will not have corrected what you said about me. Sir James gathered his gloves. You have become very confident with a duke standing behind you. Grace looked at Richard. He was not standing behind her. He was seated several feet away, exactly where she had asked him to remain. She turned back to her uncle. That may be the only part of this conversation you have failed to understand. He is not standing in front of me either. Sir James left without saying goodbye. The silence after the front door closed was almost gentle. Mrs. Harcourt rose first. Lady Atherstone, I believe the tea in the morning room has suffered enough neglect. Lady Atherstone understood immediately. The two women withdrew only as far as the adjoining room, leaving its door open. Richard remained where he was until Grace sat. Then he moved to the chair opposite her. What do you want me to say at the final assessment? Grace looked at him. Only the truth. About the fire. About yourself. He waited. Grace folded her hands in her lap. I do not want you to declare me innocent because you care for me. The evidence does that. I do not want a proposal. I do not want you to make me yours in front of the same people who heard you dismiss me. Richard's expression changed at the word dismiss, but he did not look away. What do you want? Say what you said that night. Admit that you said it. Then correct what was yours to correct. Nothing more. Nothing more. No defense of your character? The carrier, Mr. Pritchard, Mr. Vale, and the panels will speak to the facts. My character is not a ducal exhibit. A faint, sad smile touched his mouth. No, it is not. And you speak last. Agreed. Grace studied him. You do not object? I have spent most of my life believing that speaking first meant controlling the outcome. His voice softened. I am discovering that speaking last can mean listening long enough to deserve a voice at all. The words settled between them. There was no mystery left to solve that afternoon, no witness to pursue, no route to reconstruct. For the first time since the fire, they were simply a man and a woman sitting across from each other after choosing the same difficult truth. Richard stood. Grace expected him to leave. Instead, he stopped at a respectful distance. Grace. Her pulse changed at once. Yes, I want to kiss you. He did not move closer. I will not if you do not want it. The directness of it warmed her more than practiced romance could have done. He was giving her no burden except an honest choice. Grace rose. I do want it. Richard's breath caught, but he still waited. Grace crossed the space between them herself. She lifted her face and closed the final distance. His kiss was gentle, restrained, and unmistakably real. One hand rested lightly at her upper arm, as though even now he remembered that closeness was not permission to claim. Grace answered him freely. When they parted, neither pretended the moment meant forgiveness was finished or justice complete. Richard rested his forehead briefly near hers, without touching. Tomorrow, he murmured. Grace looked toward the open doorway, then back at him. Tomorrow we prepare. Her hand found his for one quiet second before she released it, and on the 6th, we tell the truth. On the 6th June, Grace returned to Beckett House for the last time as a woman accused beneath its roof. The damaged upper rooms had been left largely untouched since the fire office survey, and morning light fell through the gallery windows, across blistered wall covering, darkened floorboards, and the bare hooks where the Flemish verdure panel had once hung. The room was not crowded, but everyone present had reason to remember what was said there. The fire office representative stood near the long table with his papers. 2 creditors had come because Sir James's expected settlement affected what patience they were willing to extend him. The carrier waited awkwardly beside Mr. Pritchard, the upholsterer. Mr. Vale stood near the doorway with his clerk and a large canvas-wrapped roll kept firmly under his own supervision. Richard had arrived with Lady Atherstone. Mrs. Harcourt remained beside Grace. Diana stood near her father, white-faced and silent. Sir James looked as though he had dressed for triumph and slept for defeat. Grace noticed all of them, then looked at the fire office representative. "Where would you like me to begin?" "With the night of the fire, Miss Beckett. Only what you personally know." Grace nodded. Her voice did not shake. "I entered Miss Diana Beckett's dressing room before supper because she asked me to retrieve her gloves. I did not light a taper. I did not touch a taper stand. I left the room before the fire began." The representative turned to an assistant who opened a small box brought from fire office custody. Inside lay the soot-blackened brass night taper stand. Its base remained heat-marked. The intertwined initials DB were still visible. "This was inventoried in Miss Diana Beckett's dressing room after the fire," he said. "It has remained in fire office custody since the initial survey." Sir James shifted. "No one disputes that it belonged to Diana. Ownership is not the only point," the representative said. He called the Beckett footman who had spoken to Richard on the night of the fire. The young man stepped forward, visibly nervous. "State only what you saw." "I saw Miss Diana carry that brass taper stand upstairs before supper, sir. Before Miss Grace went up for the gloves." Diana's chin lifted. "That proves nothing about where I put it." Grace did not answer. The representative did. It establishes possession at a relevant time. Nothing more. The footman was dismissed. Grace felt Richard's gaze on her, but did not turn toward him. This was not the moment for reassurance. It was the moment for sequence. The representative looked back at Grace. "You also gave an earlier statement concerning the missing verdure panel." "Yes. I saw it removed from this house on the 10th of May, 4 days before the fire." "Yes." The carrier was called. He confirmed the collection from the servants' entrance. The large rolled wall hanging, the warning to mind its lower edge, and the delivery to Mr. Vale's Bond Street establishment. He did not embellish. Grace was grateful for that. Sir James interrupted only once. "You were told later that the object was a verdure panel." The carrier frowned. "I was told later what sort of panel folk were calling it, but I knew it was a large rolled wall hanging when I carried it, and I know where I took it." The representative made a note. "That distinction is recorded." Mr. Pritchard came next. He described the repair made the previous winter. The split near the woven ash tree, and the green silk that could not properly match the faded original. "Would you recognize your own work?" the representative asked. "I would." Mr. Vale gave a curt nod to his clerk. The cord around the canvas was untied. For the first time that morning, Sir James lost visible control of his expression. The clerk unfolded the covering while Mr. Vale kept one hand on the roll. Dark woven trees appeared, then the lower edge. Mr. Pritchard stepped closer. "There," he pointed without touching. "That green patch beside the ash trunk, that is my repair." Grace had known what would appear. Even so, seeing the panel intact in the same house where Sir James had declared it burned, struck her with almost physical force. The fire office representative turned to Mr. Vale. "When did this panel enter your custody?" "The 10th of May. "On whose authority?" "It came from Beckett House under Sir James Beckett's authority, to be held against an obligation connected with his debts." A creditor near the window drew a slow breath. Mr. Vale continued. "The panel remained in my establishment on the 14th of May. It was there during the fire. It has remained there since." The representative reached for Sir James's official loss schedule. This document lists one Flemish verdure panel as destroyed in the fire of the 14th of May. He placed the page flat on the table. "Sir James, do you dispute that this is the schedule submitted on your behalf?" Sir James stared at the paper. No. Do you dispute that this is the panel named? Silence. Grace watched her uncle calculate. She had seen him do it over bills, invitations, creditors, servants, and Diana's mistakes. For 11 years she had helped him solve difficulties before they reached rooms like this. Now there was nothing left for her to solve on his behalf. No, he said at last. Diana made a broken sound beside him. Everyone turned. Her composure vanished with astonishing speed. Father said it wouldn't matter. Sir James swung toward her. Diana. He said Grace had already been in the room. Her words came faster now, as though silence itself had become unbearable. He said everyone would believe she'd left the taper because she was always correcting me and because she'd made that remark about burning money. Grace felt Mrs. Harcourt's hand tightened around the handle of her reticule. Grace herself did not move. The representative asked, "Miss Beckett, did you leave the taper burning near the curtain?" Diana covered her mouth, then lowered her hand. "Yes," the word barely carried. "I took it upstairs. I was looking for a ribbon before supper. I left it too close to the curtain because I thought I'd only be gone a moment." "Did you intend to start a fire?" "No, of course not." Tears filled her eyes. "I forgot it. Then there was smoke. And Grace had been in the room, and Father said, if I admitted it, everyone would call me careless, and no respectable family would trust me. He said Grace could bear it better." Grace closed her eyes for 1 second. There it was. Not hatred, not conspiracy at the beginning. Something smaller and uglier. The assumption that Grace could bear whatever others did not wish to carry. The representative turned to Sir James. "And the panel?" Sir James's face had gone grey. Diana answered before he could. Father knew it hadn't burned. He said the loss would help cover what he owed. He said if Grace was already blamed for the fire, no one would look too closely at the list. "Enough," Sir James said. Richard did not move. The representative closed the loss schedule. "It is enough." His tone was not dramatic. That made the judgment heavier. The disputed claim is rejected. The panel was not destroyed. Other entries connected with the same declaration will require review. One creditor folded his papers. Then the indulgence, discussed pending settlement, no longer stands. The other nodded. "Nor mine." Sir James looked from one man to the next, but the authority he had worn so easily in this house had disappeared. No one shouted. No one threatened him. They simply stopped believing that his position entitled him to trust. Grace looked at Diana. Her cousin was crying quietly now. Grace felt no triumph. "You should have told the truth that night," she said. Diana looked at her. "I was afraid." "So was I." Nothing more needed saying. Mr. Vale's clerk wrapped the tapestry again. It remained under the dealer's supervision and would return with him. Not to Grace, not to Richard, and not to Sir James. The brass taper stand returned to its box for fire office custody. The documents were gathered. The evidence did not transform into symbols. It simply went back where it belonged. Only then did Richard step forward. He had waited until every fact had been spoken by the people who owned it. His voice, when it came, carried through the damaged gallery without effort. "There is one matter that belongs to me." Grace looked at him. Richard faced the same people who had heard his silence turned against her. On the night of the fire, Sir James challenged whether I would quarrel over Miss Beckett's word. I answered that she was not worth fighting for. No one moved. Richard continued. "I was wrong, not because any woman's worth is measured by whether a man fights over her, but because her name was worth defending, her word was worth hearing, and I used her dignity to purchase my own comfort. I failed her." Grace felt the words enter the place where the first sentence had wounded her. Richard did not look away. Miss Beckett's innocence rests on evidence, not on my favor, and not on my affection. The carrier, the upholsterer, the dealer, the fire office records, and Miss Diana's own admission have established what happened. What I can correct is only my own conduct. The room remained silent for a long moment. Grace realized that this was what public accountability felt like when it was not performance. Richard had not made himself heroic. He had made himself answerable. People began to leave. The creditors first, then the tradesmen. Mr. Vale departed with the intact panel. The fire office representative took the taper stand and official papers. Sir James left with a solicitor who had arrived for the closing formalities. Diana followed another female relative downstairs. Mrs. Harcourt and Lady Atherstone moved toward the gallery entrance but remained within proper proximity. At last Grace and Richard stood in the room where everything had begun. "You spoke last," Grace said, "as you asked, and you did not make my innocence about you. It was never mine to give you." His restraint broke then, not into passion, but into vulnerability. "Grace, there is something that is mine to say." She knew before he spoke. Her heart answered before her voice could. Richard looked at her with none of the cold control that had once protected him from discomfort. "I love you." Grace crossed the small distance between them and took his hand. "I love you too." His fingers closed around hers. There was no audience left to impress, no evidence left to produce, no lie left to defeat. Only the truth between them. Richard lifted her hand slightly, but did not kiss it. "May I court you properly?" Grace looked once at the bare hooks on the wall, then back at the man who had finally learned that love did not require possession, rescue, or spectacle. "Yes," she said, "you may." By early August, Beckett House stood half-shuttered in the Mayfair heat, its rooms being prepared to let to strangers, and Grace could pass the street without feeling that she had abandoned anything belonging to her. Sir James had withdrawn the inflated portion of his fire claim, rather than allow further scrutiny to widen publicly. But the surrender came too late to restore the confidence of his creditors. He entered a composition with them, reduced his household, and gave up the appearance of prosperity he had maintained for years by delaying bills and borrowing against possessions. No formal sentence had been necessary to break his authority. Men who had once accepted his assurances now required figures. Tradesmen who had waited politely for payment now sent accounts on exact dates. Invitations became fewer. Grace heard most of it second-hand, and discovered that she no longer needed every consequence described to feel justice had occurred. Diana had gone to live with relatives outside London and would not return for the remainder of the season. Before leaving, she sent Grace a letter containing an apology too uncertain to ask forgiveness and too ashamed to defend itself. Grace read it once, folded it, and placed it away. She did not answer immediately. Forgiveness, she had learned, was not another household duty to be performed on demand. The frightened maid fared better. Lady Atherstone arranged, with Grace's permission, and without using the girl as evidence again, for an independent reference based on her actual service. By July, the young woman had secured a respectable place in another household. That news pleased Grace more than Sir James's social discomfort ever could. It meant someone weaker had escaped paying for the sins of people stronger than herself. Grace remained in Bloomsbury during the weeks after the final assessment. Richard courted her exactly as he had asked permission to do. He called when invited. He did not appear when he had not been invited. If Mrs. Harcourt announced that Grace was tired, he left without finding a ducal reason to remain. They walked with Lady Atherstone in public gardens, attended 2 small musical evenings, and once spent nearly an hour discussing nothing more consequential than whether a portrait of Richard's grandfather made the deceased Duke look dignified or merely displeased with furniture. Grace laughed more during those weeks than she had expected. Richard seemed startled every time, then quietly delighted. What mattered most was not that he had become gentle. He had always possessed gentleness, somewhere beneath control. What mattered was that he had learned not to treat love as authority. When they discussed marriage, he began with questions instead of arrangements. Grace's annuity would remain secured to her. Her small financial independence would not disappear merely because she became a duchess. Richard listened while she explained why that mattered, then said, "I don't want you to enter my life by surrendering the part of yours that taught you how to leave when you had to." Grace looked at him across Mrs. Harcourt's drawing room. That is a very improved sentence for a man who once believed ending an argument was the same as solving it. His mouth curved. "I've had excellent criticism. Repeatedly, painfully, deservedly, entirely." She smiled. "Then perhaps there is hope for you, Grace. I am counting on it." Their banns were properly called in their respective parishes over the required Sundays. Richard did not attempt to evade ordinary forms because his rank could have made other arrangements possible. Grace found herself unexpectedly moved by that. There was something steadying in hearing their names spoken in a church among other names, their future treated not as a spectacular exception, but as a promise requiring time, witnesses, and consent. They married quietly in London in early August. Mrs. Harcourt wept before Grace did. Lady Atherstone pretended not to cry until Richard embraced her after the service, at which point she abandoned the pretense entirely. Grace wore no extravagant display of jewels. Richard made no speech about rescue, destiny, or what he could give her. When the clergyman joined their hands, he looked at her with the same vulnerability he had shown in the scorched gallery. Only now there was peace beneath it. Grace answered her vows clearly. For the first time in her life, belonging to another household did not feel like being absorbed into it. The morning after the wedding, they went to Kensington Gardens before the paths became crowded. Grace carried her plum silk parasol. The August sun was already warm, and the familiar shade above her cast a soft plum-colored light across one shoulder. Richard walked beside her in a dark morning coat, matching his pace to hers without appearing to think about it. They had been married less than a day, yet he had already asked twice whether she wished to return home, and once whether she preferred a different path. Grace finally looked at him. "Do you intend to ask my permission before every turn for the rest of our lives?" Richard considered this seriously. "No. Good. Only the important ones. And who decides which are important?" "I suspect that question is itself important." Grace laughed. "You are becoming difficult. Marriage has emboldened me." They walked farther beneath the trees. A nursemaid pushed a small carriage along a distant path. 2 elderly gentlemen argued over something in a newspaper. London continued around them, indifferent to the fact that Grace Beckett had become the Duchess of Ormskirk. Grace discovered that she liked the indifference. She did not need the world to stop and admire what had happened. She needed only to know that she had chosen it. Richard glanced toward the parasol. "You still have it?" "Of course I do." I had wondered whether becoming a duchess required a more impressive one. Grace gave him a suspicious look. Did someone suggest replacing it? No one who valued his peace. Wise. I remember what happened the last time you trusted me with it. She looked ahead, remembering Bond Street, the notes in her hands, and the way he had taken the parasol without turning the gesture into ownership. You gave it back. I was under strict instruction. You were under no instruction at all. That may have frightened me more. Grace stopped beneath an elm. Richard stopped with her. Sunlight reached half his face, leaving the other half outside the parasol's shade. He made no move to step closer beneath it. That too, she noticed. Even now, even after vows had been spoken, he waited for the space she offered, rather than assuming marriage had erased the need for choice. Grace studied him for a moment. Do you know what I thought this parasol meant when I bought it? That you had excellent taste. Naturally, I stand corrected. It was the first beautiful thing I purchased with money that was mine. No uncle chose it. No cousin borrowed it first. No household account had to justify it. I remember walking out of the shop and thinking that if it rained, I could shelter myself. Richard's expression softened. You did? Yes. She turned the handle slowly between her fingers. For years, I thought independence meant never needing to stand beneath anyone else's shelter. And now, Grace stepped closer. Now I think it means deciding who is invited beneath mine. She tilted the plum silk parasol until the shade covered them both. Richard did not reach for the handle. He only looked at her. Grace extended her free hand. He took it immediately, his fingers settling around hers with the familiar warmth that had once required courage from both of them. I love you, he said quietly. The words no longer sounded like a confession made after catastrophe. They sounded like something meant to be lived with every morning. Grace smiled. I love you too. Richard lowered his head slightly, but he waited. Grace rose onto her toes and kissed him first. It was brief, tender, and entirely hers to begin. When she drew back, he was smiling in a way London society would scarcely have recognized. They resumed walking at the same pace, their hands joined beneath the plum-colored shade. Grace still held the handle. She had simply chosen to make room beneath it.